The champagne flute trembled in my hand as I watched Brett's smug smile stretch across his face in the sterile conference room of Morrison Associates. 6 months of divorce proceedings had led to this moment, and he was savoring every second of my carefully controlled composure beginning to crack. "The wedding ring stays with me," he announced, his voice carrying that particular tone of entitlement that had become his trademark since we'd separated. "It was a gift, Julia, a symbol of what we had. Now that the marriage is broken, well," he shrugged with theatrical indifference, "it serves as a reminder of promises that couldn't be kept." Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My attorney, Patricia Chen, shifted uncomfortably beside me. We'd discussed this moment, prepared for it, but the reality of Brett's vindictiveness still managed to surprise with its calculated cruelty. The ring he refused to return wasn't just any piece of jewelry. It was my grandmother's Art Deco diamond, passed down through 3 generations of women who'd worn it with pride. The same ring I'd shown him on our 3rd date, explaining its history with the kind of vulnerability that comes from truly trusting someone. "Brett," Patricia said, her voice measured but firm, "the ring predates the marriage. It belongs to Julia's family lineage." Legally speaking, Brett interrupted, his own attorney nodding encouragingly beside him. "Julia gave it to me during our wedding ceremony. She placed it on her finger and said, 'With this ring, I thee wed.' That makes it part of the marital exchange, a gift. And gifts don't get returned when relationships end badly." The conference room felt suffocating. Late afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows of the mid-tier law firm, casting long shadows across the polished table where our marriage was being dissected like a failed business venture. I'd chosen Patricia Chen precisely because she wasn't part of the old boys network that Brett navigated so effortlessly. She was sharp, methodical, and had a reputation for protecting clients from vindictive spouses. But even she seemed momentarily stunned by the depths of Brett's pettiness. "Mr. Langford," Patricia tried again, "your client is asking for the return of a family heirloom that holds significant sentimental value and predates the marriage by several decades. Surely there's room for reasonable accommodation here." Brett's attorney, a silver-haired man named Douglas Fitzgerald who'd been managing the Langford family's legal affairs for 20 years, cleared his throat. "My client has been more than generous in these proceedings. Mrs. Reeve is receiving a substantial settlement, despite the relatively short duration of the marriage. The ring issue is non-negotiable." I found my voice, though it came out quieter than I'd intended. "Brett, that ring was my grandmother's. You know what it means to me. You know the stories I told you about her wearing it through the Depression, through World War II, through raising 5 children alone when my grandfather died young. It's not about money or property division. It's about family history." For a moment, something flickered behind Brett's eyes. A recognition of the pain he was inflicting, perhaps even a whisper of the man I'd once loved. But it vanished as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the cold satisfaction of someone who'd found the perfect pressure point. "Family history," he repeated, as if tasting the words. "That's interesting, Julia, because I seem to remember you being quite eager to abandon your family history when you married into mine. All those charity galas where you introduced yourself as Mrs. Langford, all those country club memberships where you seemed happy enough to trade your humble origins for a little southern prestige." The words hit their mark with surgical precision. Brett had always been skilled at finding vulnerabilities and exploiting them with a smile. It was what made him such an effective corporate lawyer, and what had made him such a devastating husband once our marriage began to unravel. "That's different," I said, hating how defensive I sounded. "Supporting your career doesn't mean erasing my identity, doesn't it?" Brett leaned back in his chair, the picture of relaxed confidence. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you spent 3 years trying to become someone else entirely. Someone worthy of the Langford name. And now that it's over, you want to take a piece of that identity with you." The ring represented something far more complex than Brett was admitting, and we both knew it. Yes, I'd given up my fast-track career at a prestigious Washington firm to support his ambitions. Yes, I'd moved to Charleston to be closer to his family's business interests. Yes, I'd played the role of the dutiful wife at countless social functions where my Northern Virginia background was treated as a charming quirk rather than a legitimate part of my identity. But the ring had never been about status or aspiration. It had been about love, about connecting my past to my future, about carrying forward the strength of the women who'd worn it before me. When I'd slipped it onto my finger during our wedding ceremony, I'd been thinking of my grandmother whispering stories about resilience and endurance, not about joining some exclusive social club. Brett, I said, trying one more time, please? I'm not asking for anything else. I'm not fighting the settlement terms. I'm not demanding spousal support. I just want my grandmother's ring back. He studied me for a long moment, as if considering the request. Hope flickered in my chest despite everything I knew about his character. Then he smiled, and I realized he'd been savoring this moment from the beginning. No, he said simply. I think I'll keep it. Consider it a reminder of what happens when people bite the hand that feeds them. The comment was a reference to our final fight, the one that had ended our marriage irreparably. I'd discovered that Brett had been systematically undermining my career behind the scenes, using his family's influence to block job opportunities and professional connections. When I'd confronted him about it, he'd actually seemed surprised by my anger. I was protecting you, he'd said, as if sabotaging my independence was a form of love. You're not built for the kind of pressure that comes with high-level legal work. I was trying to save you from failure. The condescension in his voice had been breathtaking. This was the man who'd once claimed to admire my intelligence and ambition, who'd supposedly fallen in love with my drive and determination. Yet when our marriage began to falter, he'd decided that the solution was to make me smaller, more dependent, more controllable. The ring stays with me, Brett repeated, bringing me back to the present. Final decision. Patricia gathered her papers with barely concealed frustration. We'll need to document this for the record. Mrs. Reeve is formally requesting the return of property that predates the marriage, and you're refusing based on the fact that it was given freely during the marriage ceremony, Fitzgerald interjected smoothly. The law is quite clear on this point. I watched Brett's face as his attorney spoke, noting the satisfaction that played across his features. This wasn't about legal precedent or property rights. This was about power, about his need to prove that he could still control and hurt me even after our marriage had ended. The meeting concluded with handshakes and hollow pleasantries. Patricia walked me to the elevator, her expression apologetic. I'm sorry, Julia. I really thought we could make him see reason on this one. The ring clearly has sentimental value that far exceeds its monetary worth. It's fine, I said though. We both knew it wasn't. I should have expected this. We could appeal, try to get a court order. No, the word came out more forcefully than I'd intended. I'm done with courts and appeals and trying to reason with Brett. He's made his choice. The elevator arrived with a soft ding, and I stepped inside. As the doors closed, I caught a glimpse of Brett through the conference room window, still talking animatedly with his attorney. He looked like a man who'd just won an important victory, someone who'd successfully defended his territory against an unwanted invasion. What he didn't know was that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. The drive back to my apartment took me through the historic district of Charleston, past the grand homes where Brett's family had established their social prominence generations ago. Spanish moss draped from ancient oak trees, creating a canopy of Southern Gothic beauty that had once enchanted me. Now it felt oppressive, like a reminder of everything I'd never quite been able to belong to. My phone buzzed with a text from my paralegal, Reggie Taylor. How did it go? Please tell me he wasn't as terrible as we expected. I pulled over to respond. Worse. He's keeping the ring. Time to have that conversation we discussed. Reggie's response came immediately. Meet me at the office. I've got bourbon and a very interesting file you need to see. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in my small law practice, sharing a glass of Maker's Mark with the smartest person I'd ever hired. Reggie had been my first employee when I'd started my own firm. After leaving the big corporate practice, he'd dropped out of law school during his final year due to financial pressures, but his legal mind was sharper than most practicing attorneys I knew. Tell me you found something, I said, savoring the burn of the whiskey. Oh honey, I found something. Reggie pulled out a thick folder and spread its contents across my desk. I've been doing some very creative research into the Langford Family Trust, and let me tell you, Charles Langford Seoster was a man who believed in insurance policies. I leaned forward, studying the documents. What kind of insurance policies? The kind that protect family assets from unworthy heirs. The kind that include very specific clauses about fiduciary responsibility and moral fitness. Reggie's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of someone who'd uncovered a particularly juicy secret. The kind that reference old debts to men named Clifford Reeve. My father's name on a legal document connected to the Langford estate sent a chill down my spine. How is that possible? My father died 10 years ago. He never mentioned knowing Charles Langford. That's because your father was a modest man who didn't like to brag about his accomplishments. But according to these documents, he once provided legal services to Charles Langford, Seaster. That saved the family business from a very nasty bankruptcy. We're talking about a debt that was never repaid, and a promise that was never honored. I picked up one of the documents, scanning the dense legal language. What kind of promise? The kind that includes a clause about unspecified surviving descendants having trustee oversight in the event of mismanagement or misconduct by the primary beneficiary. Reggie's smile was predatory. The kind that gives you legal standing to challenge Brett's management of the estate. The implications hit me like a physical blow. You're saying I have legal grounds to go after Brett's inheritance? I'm saying that your ex-husband has been playing with fire, and he's about to get burned, because according to these documents, he's been systematically mismanaging trust assets for personal gain. And according to the terms his own father set up, that gives you the right to step in as an alternate trustee. I sat back in my chair, processing the information. How did you find this? Let's just say that when you've spent as much time in law libraries as I have, you learn to follow paper trails that most people don't even know exist. Plus, I may have called in a few favors from friends who work in estate planning. Reggie's expression grew serious. The question is, what do you want to do with this information? The answer came to me with startling clarity. Brett had taken something precious from me, something that connected me to my family's history and my own identity. He'd done it out of spite, out of a need to prove his power over me. He'd weaponized sentimentality and used my emotions against me. Now it was my turn to play chess, while he was still playing checkers. I want to take everything, I said quietly. I want to use his father's own words against him. I want to show him what happens when you underestimate someone just because you think you've broken them. Reggie raised his glass in a mock toast. To revenge served cold and legally airtight. We drank to that, and I began to plan the most methodical, patient campaign of my life. Brett had kept my grandmother's ring, thinking it would be the last wound he could inflict. Instead, he'd just given me the motivation to destroy everything he actually cared about. The ring was about sentiment and memory, but the Langford fortune was about power and legacy. And I was about to teach Brett Langford the difference between what you can take and what you can keep. The Langford family estate sat on 12 acres of pristine Charleston waterfront, its antebellum architecture framed by centuries-old live oaks and manicured gardens that required a staff of 6 to maintain. I'd been inside the mansion exactly 3 times during my marriage to Brett, each visit a carefully orchestrated performance designed to remind me of my place in the family hierarchy. Now, sitting in my Honda Civic across from the estate's wrought iron gates, I watched Brett's Mercedes disappear down the circular drive. He was leaving for his weekly golf game at the Charleston Country Club, a ritual that would keep him occupied for the next 4 hours. Plenty of time for what I needed to do. My phone buzzed with a text from Reggie. Package delivered. Miriam should be reading it right about now. Phase 1 of my plan was about to begin. 3 weeks had passed since my revelation about the hidden clauses in Charles Langford Seaster East trust documents. 3 weeks of careful preparation, strategic positioning, and the kind of methodical research that had made me a formidable estate attorney before I'd sacrificed my career on the altar of Brett's ambition. The package Reggie had delivered was a carefully crafted letter to Miriam Langford, Brett's older sister and the family's designated keeper of appearances. The letter, sent through an intermediary law firm, detailed concerns about potential mismanagement of trust assets and requested a meeting to discuss fiduciary responsibilities. Miriam was the key to everything. At 42, she was 3 years older than Brett and infinitely more intelligent, but she'd been systematically marginalized within the family power structure because of her gender. While Brett had inherited control of the business empire, Miriam had been relegated to managing the family's charitable foundation, a role that was important but largely ceremonial. What Brett didn't know was that Miriam had been quietly seething about this arrangement for years. And what neither of them knew was that their father had included several provisions in his trust that could shift the balance of power if the right pressure was applied. My phone rang as I sat watching the estate. Miriam's voice was crisp and professional, but I could hear the underlying tension. Mrs. Reeve, this is Miriam Langford. I believe you wanted to discuss some concerns regarding the family trust. Thank you for calling, Miriam. I know this is an unusual situation, given my relationship with Brett. Your former relationship, she corrected coolly, which is why I'm curious about your interest in family business matters. I took a deep breath. This conversation would determine whether my plan succeeded or failed. I recently discovered that my late father, Clifford Reeve, had a business relationship with your father that was never properly resolved. It involves certain obligations that may affect the current management of the trust. There was a long pause. I'm not aware of any connection between our families prior to your marriage to Brett. That's because your father was a private man who didn't advertise his debts of honor. But according to the documents I've uncovered, he made certain promises to my father that create ongoing obligations to his surviving descendants. Another pause, longer this time. What kind of obligations? The kind that give me legal standing to request an audit of trust management. The kind that could result in alternate trustee arrangements if current management is found to be inadequate. I could practically hear the gears turning in Miriam's mind. She was sharp enough to understand the implications immediately. Are you suggesting that Brett has been mismanaging trust assets? I'm suggesting that there are discrepancies that warrant investigation. And I'm suggesting that you might be interested in ensuring that your father's wishes are being properly honored. Where would you like to meet? 30 minutes later, I was sitting across from Miriam in a quiet corner of the Charleston Library's rare books section. She'd chosen the location, probably to avoid being seen with me in any of the social venues where the Langford family was known. Miriam had always been the more formidable of the two Langford siblings. Where Brett relied on charm and inherited privilege, she possessed genuine intelligence and a spine of steel. She'd graduated magna cum laude from Duke, earned an MBA from Wharton, and had been quietly building a reputation as a philanthropic powerhouse throughout the Southeast. She was also, I suspected, tired of playing second fiddle to her less capable brother. Show me, she said without preamble. I opened my briefcase and spread out copies of the documents Reggie had uncovered. Your father and mine met in 1987, when Charles Langford Seoster was facing a hostile takeover of his manufacturing company. A group of investors from Atlanta was attempting to buy out his shareholders and break up the business. Miriam nodded. I remember that. It was a very difficult time for the family. Your father hired several legal firms to fight the takeover, but it was my father who found the loophole that saved the company. A technical violation of SEC disclosure rules that invalidated the entire acquisition attempt. I pointed to a specific clause in the trust documents. In gratitude, your father included this provision. In recognition of services rendered by Clifford Reeve, and in acknowledgement of debts that cannot be repaid in currency, the surviving descendants of said Clifford Reeve shall retain advisory capacity and oversight authority in matters of trust management, to be activated at their discretion in cases of demonstrated incompetence or malfeasance. Miriam's eyes widened as she read the clause. I've never seen this before. It was buried in the supplemental documents, the ones that lawyers usually don't read because they assume they're boilerplate language. Your father was very careful about protecting his assets from unworthy heirs. What exactly are you alleging about Brett's management? I opened a second folder, this one containing financial documents that Reggie had obtained through his network of contacts in the Charleston business community. Over the past 2 years, Brett has been using trust assets to fund personal investments, high-risk real estate ventures, speculative technology stocks, and at least one cryptocurrency scheme that lost nearly $500,000. Miriam studied the documents, her expression growing increasingly grim. These transactions weren't approved by the trust board. That's because Brett has been bypassing the board by classifying them as operational expenses and business development costs. It's not technically illegal, but it's certainly not what your father intended when he structured the trust. How much are we talking about? Approximately $2.3 million in questionable transactions over the past 18 months. And that's just what I've been able to document so far. Miriam sat back in her chair, processing the information. What do you want from me? Access to the complete trust documents, financial records for the past 3 years, and your cooperation. In exercising my rights as an alternate trustee. In exchange for what? In exchange for ensuring that trust assets are properly managed and that your father's wishes are honored. And in exchange for making sure that you have the authority you deserve within the family business structure. I could see the temptation in her eyes. Miriam had been marginalized for years, treated as a decorative figurehead while Brett made increasingly reckless decisions with the family fortune. The opportunity to assert real power was clearly appealing. This is about more than just financial management, isn't it? She said quietly. This is about your divorce. Brett kept something that belonged to me, something that had nothing to do with our marriage settlement, but everything to do with his need to prove his power over me. I met her gaze steadily. I'm not interested in revenge for its own sake. I'm interested in justice. And I'm interested in ensuring that the Langford family legacy is protected from someone who views it as his personal piggy bank. Miriam was quiet for a long moment, weighing her options. Finally, she nodded. I'll need to see the complete documentation, and I'll need assurance that this won't damage the family's reputation. The goal is to protect the family's reputation, not damage it. But that requires removing Brett from a position he's proven unfit to hold. What's your timeline? I need access to the trust documents within the next 2 weeks. After that, it's simply a matter of following the proper legal procedures. Miriam gathered up the documents and slipped them into her purse. I'll be in touch. As she walked away, I felt the first stirring of satisfaction I'd experienced since the divorce proceedings began. Brett had underestimated me, assuming that his vindictive gesture with the ring would be the final chapter in our story. Instead, he'd just given me the motivation to write an entirely new ending. The second phase of my plan began 3 days later, when Miriam called to arrange a meeting at the family's law firm. Apparently, her review of the trust documents had revealed even more irregularities than I'd initially uncovered. Douglas Fitzgerald has been the family's attorney for 20 years, she explained as we sat in her car outside the firm's historic downtown office. He's either complicit in Brett's activities or he's been deliberately kept in the dark. Either way, he's about to have a very uncomfortable conversation. The meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock, ostensibly to discuss trust administration matters. Brett wouldn't be attending, Miriam had explained, because he was in Atlanta on business. What she hadn't mentioned was that she'd deliberately scheduled the meeting during his absence. Douglas Fitzgerald was a silver-haired Southern gentleman who'd built his practice on discretion and old family connections. He greeted me with polite wariness, clearly uncertain about my role in the proceedings. Mrs. Reeve, he said, settling behind his massive mahogany desk. Miriam tells me you've raised some concerns about trust management. I have to say, I'm not sure what standing you have in these matters. I placed a copy of the trust documents on his desk with the relevant clause highlighted. I believe my father's relationship with Charles Langford Seoster gives me certain rights and responsibilities. Fitzgerald studied the documents, his expression growing increasingly troubled. I'm not familiar with this particular provision. That's because it was added as a supplemental amendment, filed separately from the main trust documents. It's quite legal, but it was designed to be discreet. What exactly are you alleging? Miriam leaned forward. We're alleging that Brett has been systematically misusing trust assets for personal gain, and we're requesting a full audit of his management practices. For the next hour, we presented our evidence, the unauthorized investments, the questionable expense categories, the pattern of financial decisions that prioritize Brett's personal interests over the trust's stated purposes. Fitzgerald listened, in increasingly uncomfortable silence, occasionally asking questions that revealed just how much he'd been kept in the dark about Brett's activities. This is quite serious, he finally said. If these allegations are accurate, Brett has violated his fiduciary duties as trustee. The question is, I said carefully, what are you prepared to do about it? Fitzgerald was quiet for a long moment. The trust documents are clear. If a trustee is found to have acted improperly, the alternate trustees have the authority to assume management responsibilities. And who are the alternate trustees? According to the original documents, Miriam is the primary alternate, but this supplemental provision suggests that you would have co-trustee authority. I felt a surge of satisfaction. Then I'm formally requesting activation of the alternate trustee provisions, and I'm requesting a complete audit of all trust activities for the past 3 years. This will destroy Brett financially, Fitzgerald warned. If he's forced to repay misappropriated funds, he could lose everything. Then he should have thought about that before he decided to play games with trust assets, Miriam said coldly. And before he decided to use family resources to fund his personal vendettas. The last comment was a reference to something else. I'd discovered during my research, Brett had been using trust funds to pay for private investigators to monitor my activities during the divorce proceedings. It was another violation of fiduciary duty, and another example of his inability to separate personal grievances from professional responsibilities. I'll need to file the appropriate paperwork, Fitzgerald said reluctantly. And I'll need to notify Brett of these developments. Of course, I said. But I trust you'll handle this with the discretion that the Langford family expects. As we left the meeting, Miriam was unusually quiet. Finally, she spoke. You know this will destroy my relationship with Brett permanently. Your relationship with Brett was already damaged by his inability to respect your intelligence and capabilities. This just makes it official. She nodded slowly. He's going to fight this. Let him fight. The law is on our side, and the evidence is overwhelming. Besides, Brett has never been particularly good at fighting battles he can't win through charm and intimidation. That evening, I sat in my apartment with a glass of wine and my grandmother's jewelry box. The ring was missing, of course, but the other pieces were still there. The pearl earrings she'd worn to her own wedding, the cameo brooch that had belonged to her mother, the delicate gold chain that had been passed down through generations of strong women. Soon, I would have the power to force Brett to return what he'd stolen. But more importantly, I would have proven that his assumption about my powerlessness had been catastrophically wrong. The ring was just the beginning. By the time I was finished, Brett would understand that some battles are won not through force or cruelty, but through patience, intelligence, and the careful application of legal precision. He'd kept my grandmother's ring as a trophy of his victory over me. Soon, it would be all he had left. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, jarring me from the first peaceful sleep I'd had in weeks. Brett's voice was tight with barely controlled fury, the polished charm completely stripped away to reveal the rage beneath. What the hell do you think you're doing, Julia? I sat up in bed, immediately alert. Good morning to you too, Brett. I assume Douglas Fitzgerald has been in touch. You're goddamn right he has. He says you're claiming some kind of authority over the family trust. Says you've got Miriam convinced that I've been mismanaging assets. I'm not claiming anything, Brett. I'm exercising legal rights that your father specifically included in the trust documents. Rights that exist because of services my father provided to your family. That's bullshit and you know it. Your father was nobody, Julia. He was a small-town lawyer who never amounted to anything. He couldn't possibly have had any significant relationship with my father. The dismissiveness in his voice was breathtaking, but not surprising. Brett had always viewed my family background as something to be politely tolerated rather than respected. Now he was revealing just how little he'd actually thought of my father's accomplishments. My father saved your family's business empire, Brett. In 1987, when your father was facing a hostile takeover, it was Clifford Reeve who found the legal loophole that prevented the acquisition. Your father acknowledged that debt in writing, and he included provisions in the trust to honor it. Even if that's true, it doesn't give you the right to interfere with family business matters. Actually, it does. Your father was very specific about the circumstances under which alternate trustees could assume management responsibilities, and your systematic misuse of trust assets meets those criteria perfectly. There was a long pause. What misuse? I've been managing the trust according to established protocols. Is that what you call using trust funds to pay for private investigators to monitor your ex-wife? Is that what you call investing family money in cryptocurrency schemes and speculative real estate ventures without board approval? Another pause. Longer this time. You've been spying on me. I've been doing my job as an attorney and a concerned party. The same job your father expected me to do when he included those provisions in the trust. This is about the ring, isn't it? This whole elaborate scheme is because you're pissed off about a piece of jewelry. I got out of bed and walked to the window, looking out at the Charleston skyline. The ring was just the symptom, Brett. The real disease is your inability to understand that actions have consequences. You're going to regret this, Julia. I don't know what game you think you're playing, but I promise you, I'm better at this than you are. We'll see about that. He hung up without another word, leaving me with the satisfaction of knowing that my plan was working exactly as intended. Brett was rattled, off balance, and making the kind of mistakes that would only strengthen my position. The next phase began 2 hours later, when Miriam called to report that Brett had demanded an emergency meeting with the entire family. Apparently, he was planning to present his side of the story before the trust audit could be completed. He's calling it a family crisis meeting, she explained. He wants to portray you as an outsider who's trying to destroy the family legacy. When is this meeting scheduled? Tomorrow afternoon. He's insisted that it take place at the estate, in the formal dining room. He's trying to use the setting to reinforce his authority. I smiled. Brett was making another tactical error. The formal dining room was where the family held their most important discussions, but it was also where Charles Langford Seaster had made his most significant decisions. The setting would actually reinforce my connection to the family's patriarch. Will you be there? Of course. And I'll be presenting the audit findings that Douglas has prepared. Brett doesn't know yet, but the review has uncovered even more irregularities than we initially documented. What kind of irregularities? The kind that suggest a pattern of systematic theft rather than simple mismanagement. Brett has been treating the trust like his personal checking account for years. The meeting was scheduled for 3 o'clock, which gave me time to prepare my presentation carefully. I spent the morning reviewing every document, every financial record, every piece of evidence that supported my case. By the time I arrived at the Langford estate, I was ready for whatever Brett might throw at me. The formal dining room was exactly as I remembered it: dark wood paneling, crystal chandeliers, and oil portraits of previous generations of Langfords looking down with stern disapproval. Brett had positioned himself at the head of the table, in the chair that had traditionally belonged to his father. It was another symbolic gesture, an attempt to establish his authority through physical dominance. Miriam sat to his right, her expression carefully neutral. Douglas Fitzgerald occupied the seat to Brett's left, a thick folder of documents placed precisely in front of him. At the far end of the table, 2 additional chairs had been arranged for the other family members who would be participating via video conference. Julia, Brett said as I entered, his voice carrying false warmth. Thank you for coming. I know this is an unusual situation, but I felt it was important to clear the air about these misunderstandings. I took the seat directly across from him, noting that he'd chosen the arrangement carefully. This wasn't a collaborative discussion. It was a confrontation, with the table serving as a battlefield between us. There are no misunderstandings, Brett. There are only facts and legal obligations. That's exactly what I want to discuss. Because I think there's been some confusion about the nature of your relationship to this family and your authority regarding trust matters. The video conference connected, bringing Brett's aunt and uncle into the discussion. They were both in their 70s, longtime Charleston residents who'd known the family for decades. Brett had clearly briefed them on his version of events, because they greeted me with polite but obvious suspicion. Now then, Brett began, settling back in his chair with practiced confidence. I've called this meeting because Julia has made some very serious allegations about my management of the family trust. Allegations that I believe are motivated by personal grievances rather than legitimate concerns about fiduciary responsibility. He was good at this, I had to admit. The smooth delivery, the reasonable tone, the careful positioning of himself as the victim of a vindictive ex-wife. It was exactly the kind of performance that had made him successful in corporate law. Julia claims that her father had some kind of business relationship with my father that gives her authority over trust management. She's produced documents that she says support this claim. But what she hasn't mentioned is that these documents have never been part of the standard trust administration, and they were never disclosed during our marriage, because your father specifically structured them to be confidential. I interjected. He didn't want the provisions to be activated unless absolutely necessary, or because they don't actually exist in any meaningful legal sense, Brett countered. Douglas, would you please explain the legal status of these alleged provisions? Fitzgerald cleared his throat uncomfortably. The documents are complex. They reference services provided by Clifford Reeve, and they do include language about alternate trustee arrangements. But the specific circumstances under which these provisions would be activated are somewhat ambiguous. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Ambiguous how? Miriam asked, The language refers to demonstrated incompetence or malfeasance on the part of the primary trustee, but it doesn't define those terms precisely. Brett smiled triumphantly. Exactly. So, even if we accept that these provisions exist, Julia would have to prove that I've been incompetent or engaged in malfeasance. And I think my management record speaks for itself, does it? I opened my briefcase and removed a thick folder, because I've been reviewing that management record very carefully, and I've found some interesting patterns. For the next 20 minutes, I presented my case with the methodical precision that had made me a formidable estate attorney. I detailed the unauthorized investments, the questionable expense categories, the systematic diversion of trust assets for personal use. I showed how Brett had been using family money to fund his lifestyle, his business ventures, and his personal vendettas. The most damaging evidence was the payment to private investigators during. The scope of Brett's deception was breathtaking. For years, he had been presenting himself as a successful businessman expanding the family empire, when in reality he had been systematically destroying it. The trust that his father had carefully built over decades was being hollowed out from within. There's more, Reggie continued, pulling out another set of documents. Remember that cryptocurrency investment we found? The one that supposedly lost money? Don't tell me. Oh, I'm telling you. The cryptocurrency never existed. Brett pocketed the entire investment and created fake trading records to show losses. $500,000 straight into his personal account. I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of Brett's betrayal. This wasn't just financial mismanagement. This was sophisticated fraud on a scale that would destroy not just Brett, but potentially the entire family legacy. Have you shared this with Miriam yet? I wanted to run it by you first. But Julia, there's something else you need to know. Brett has been liquidating assets to cover his tracks. He's been selling off pieces of the family's real estate portfolio and using the proceeds to fund his schemes. Which properties? The commercial building downtown, the beach house in Kiowa Island, and 3 rental properties in the historic district, all sold within the past 18 months, with the proceeds disappearing into his shell companies. The implications hit me like a physical blow. He's been preparing for this. He knew someone would eventually discover what he was doing, so he's been converting family assets to cash that he could control. Gets worse. I think he's planning to run. Reggie pulled out a travel itinerary printed from Brett's personal email account. One-way ticket to Grand Cayman, departing tomorrow afternoon. No return date. I stared at the itinerary, my mind racing. How did you get access to his email? Let's just say that Brett's password security is about as sophisticated as his financial ethics. The man uses Langford 1 to 3 for everything. If Brett fled to the Cayman Islands, recovering the stolen assets would become infinitely more complicated. The islands had strict banking privacy laws that made it nearly impossible to trace hidden assets. He could disappear with millions of dollars and live comfortably while his family dealt with the financial wreckage he'd left behind. We need to stop him, I said. How? We don't have criminal charges filed yet, and the civil proceedings will take months to work through the courts. I thought for a moment, then reached for my phone. We can't stop him legally, but we might be able to stop him practically. I dialed Miriam's number. She answered on the first ring. Julia? Please tell me you have good news about the audit. I have news. Whether it's good or bad depends on how quickly we can act. Brett is planning to flee the country tomorrow, and he's been stealing from the family trust for years on a scale that makes our previous estimates look like pocket change. There was a long silence. How much? Conservatively, $23 million. Possibly more once the audit is complete. Dear God, Miriam, I need you to listen carefully. Brett is planning to disappear to the Cayman Islands with whatever liquid assets he can access. If he succeeds, your family will lose everything. What can we do? We can use the emergency provisions in the trust documents to freeze all accounts and revoke his access to family assets. But it has to happen before his flight tomorrow afternoon. Can we do that legally? Douglas Fitzgerald is the trustee of record. If he's presented with evidence of imminent financial harm to the trust, he has the authority to take emergency protective measures. I'll call him immediately. There's one more thing. We need to consider criminal charges. What Brett has done goes far beyond civil violations. This is felony theft on a massive scale. Another pause. That would destroy the family's reputation. Brett has already destroyed the family's reputation. The question is whether you're going to let him destroy the family fortune as well. The next 6 hours were a blur of emergency meetings, hastily drafted legal documents, and frantic phone calls to financial institutions. Douglas Fitzgerald, faced with irrefutable evidence of Brett's theft, moved with surprising speed to freeze all trust accounts and revoke Brett's access to family assets. By 10 o'clock that evening, every bank account, investment portfolio, and credit line associated with the Langford Family Trust had been locked down. Brett's corporate credit cards were canceled, his signature authority was revoked, and his access to the family's legal entities was terminated. The next morning, I was sitting in my office when my phone rang. Brett's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "What have you done?" "I've protected your family's assets from further theft." "You should be thanking me. You've frozen my accounts. I can't access any of my funds." "Those aren't your funds, Brett. They're trust assets that you've been systematically stealing for years. I built this business. I've earned every dollar. You've stolen every dollar. And now you're going to pay it back." There was a long pause. "This is about the ring, isn't it? All of this insanity because of a piece of jewelry. The ring was just the beginning. This is about justice. This is about making sure that people face consequences for their actions." "What do you want?" "I want full restitution of all stolen assets. I want your resignation from all positions within the family business. And I want my grandmother's ring returned. And if I refuse, then Miriam and I will file criminal charges this afternoon. Theft of fiduciary funds, wire fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. You'll spend the next 10 to 15 years in federal prison." Another pause, longer this time. "You're bluffing. Try me." "Everything you've done has been for the benefit of Brett Langford," I said quietly. "The question is whether this family is going to continue enabling that behavior or whether they're going to honor your father's wishes. My father trusted me with this responsibility. He chose me to lead the family business. Your father also included provisions to protect the family assets from mismanagement. He was smart enough to know that trust without accountability leads to corruption." Brett turned to Douglas Fitzgerald. "Douglas, you've known this family for 20 years. You know I would never intentionally harm the family interests." Fitzgerald removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes warily. "Brett, intention isn't the issue here. The legal requirements are clear. A trustee has fiduciary duties that cannot be compromised by personal considerations." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that based on the evidence presented today, there are grounds for removing you as trustee and activating the alternate management provisions." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Brett's face went through a series of emotions: disbelief, anger, and finally, something that looked like fear. "You can't do this. I won't let you destroy everything my father built." "Your father built safeguards into the trust specifically to prevent this kind of destruction," Miriam said. "Julia isn't threatening the family legacy. She's protecting it." Brett turned to me, his eyes blazing with fury. "This is all about revenge, isn't it? This whole elaborate scheme because I wouldn't give you back a piece of jewelry. This is about justice," I replied calmly. "The ring was just the catalyst that made me look closely enough to see what you've been doing to your family's heritage." "You want to know about heritage?" Brett's voice was rising, his Southern gentleman facade finally cracking completely. "Let me tell you about heritage. My family built this fortune over for generations. We've been pillars of this community since before your family even left whatever backwater town they crawled out of. You were nothing when I married you. Nothing. A nobody lawyer from a nobody family with delusions of grandeur." The insult was so vicious, so carefully calculated to inflict maximum damage, that it actually took my breath away for a moment. But then I felt something unexpected: pity. This was what Brett had always been underneath the charm and privilege. A small, frightened man who could only feel powerful by making others feel small. "You're right," I said quietly. "My family didn't have 4 generations of Charleston prominence. We just had 4 generations of people who worked hard, kept their word, and honored their debts. People like my father, who saved your family's business and never asked for recognition or reward." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the manicured gardens that surrounded the estate. "Your father understood that kind of integrity. That's why he included those provisions in the trust. He knew that real character isn't inherited. It's earned." When I turned back to the table, Brett was staring at me with naked hatred. "This isn't over. Actually, it is." I gathered my documents and placed them back in my briefcase. "Douglas will file the appropriate paperwork tomorrow. The alternate trustee provisions will be activated, and a full audit of all trust assets will be conducted by an independent firm. And then we'll see how much of the family fortune you've managed to squander on your ego and your grudges. Brett's aunt spoke up from the video conference. Julia, what happens to Brett if the audit confirms these allegations? That depends on how cooperative he is with the remediation process. If he's willing to make restitution for the misappropriated funds, it might be possible to avoid criminal charges. Criminal charges? Brett's voice cracked. Misuse of fiduciary funds is a felony in South Carolina, particularly when the amounts involved reach into the millions. The meeting ended with Brett storming out of the dining room, slamming the door behind him with enough force to rattle the crystal in the china cabinet. His relatives on the video conference offered awkward apologies before disconnecting. Miriam and Douglas began discussing the practical details of the trustee transition. I stood at the window for a long moment, processing what had just happened. In the span of 2 hours, I had gone from being Brett's dismissed ex-wife to being a co-trustee of one of Charleston's oldest family fortunes. It was a level of power I had never sought, but which I now intended to use very carefully. Julia, Miriam's voice broke through my reverie. Are you all right? I'm fine. Just thinking about what comes next. What does come next? I turned to face her. We fix what Brett broke. We restore the trust to its intended purposes. And we make sure this never happens again. And Brett? Brett will have to live with the consequences of his choices. Just like the rest of us, the independent audit began 3 days later, conducted by Morrison Associates, a forensic accounting firm that specialized in complex trust investigations. What they found in the first week alone was enough to make Douglas Fitzgerald consider early retirement. I was sitting in my office, reviewing the preliminary findings, when Reggie burst through the door with barely contained excitement. Honey, you need to see this, he announced, waving a thick folder. The rabbit hole goes so much deeper than we thought. How much deeper? Try $23 million deeper. Brett hasn't just been skimming from the trust. He's been running a full-scale embezzlement operation disguised as business development. Reggie spread the documents across my desk with the flourish of a magician revealing his greatest trick. Look at this. Phantom consulting contracts, shell companies in Delaware, real estate transactions that exist only on paper. He's been systematically looting the family fortune for at least 7 years. I studied the financial charts and transaction records, feeling a mixture of vindication and horror. How did he hide this from the board? Easy. He controlled the information flow. The quarterly reports he presented were sanitized versions that showed only the profitable investments. The losses and the questionable transactions were buried in subsidiary accounts that the board never saw. What about Douglas Fitzgerald? He had to sign off on major expenditures. That's the beautiful part. Brett had signature authority for anything under $200,000. He just broke down the larger thefts into smaller chunks that flew under the radar. I picked up one of the documents, a real estate purchase agreement for a property in Hilton Head. This shows a $3 million investment in a luxury resort development that doesn't exist. The address is a vacant lot that Brett bought for $50,000, and then inflated to resort value on the trust books. Intended to use very carefully. Julia? Miriam's voice broke through my reverie. Are you all right? I'm fine. Just thinking about what comes next. What does come next? I turned to face her. We fix what Brett broke. We restore the trust to its intended purposes. And we make sure this never happens again. And Brett? Brett will have to live with the consequences of his choices. Just like the rest of us. The independent audit began 3 days later, conducted by Morrison Associates, a forensic accounting firm that specialized in complex trust investigations. What they found in the first week alone was enough to make Douglas Fitzgerald consider early retirement. I was sitting in my office, reviewing the preliminary findings, when Reggie burst through the door with barely contained excitement. Honey, you need to see this, he announced, waving a thick folder. The rabbit hole goes so much deeper than we thought. How much deeper? Try $23 million deeper. Brett hasn't just been skimming from the trust. He's been running a full-scale embezzlement operation disguised as business development. Reggie spread the documents across my desk with the flourish of a magician revealing his greatest trick. Look at this. Phantom consulting contracts, shell companies in Delaware, real estate transactions that exist only on paper. He's been systematically looting the family fortune for at least 7 years. I studied the financial charts and transaction records, feeling a mixture of vindication and horror. How did he hide this from the board? Easy. He controlled the information flow. The quarterly reports he presented were sanitized versions that showed only the profitable investments. The losses and the questionable transactions were buried in subsidiary accounts that the board never saw. What about Douglas Fitzgerald? He had to sign off on major expenditures. That's the beautiful part. Brett had signature authority for anything under $200,000. He just broke down the larger thefts into smaller chunks that flew under the radar. I picked up one of the documents, a real estate purchase agreement for a property in Hilton Head. This shows a $3 million investment in a luxury resort development that doesn't exist. The address is a vacant lot that Brett bought for $50,000 and the line went dead. 20 minutes later, Douglas Fitzgerald called to report that Brett had arrived at his office, demanding an emergency meeting with all parties involved. The second family meeting took place in Douglas Fitzgerald's conference room, a more neutral venue than the Langford estate. Brett arrived looking haggard and desperate, his usual polish replaced by the wild-eyed desperation of a cornered animal. "This is extortion," he announced without preamble. "You're using family loyalty to blackmail me into admitting to crimes I didn't commit. The only crime here is theft," Miriam replied coldly. "And the evidence is overwhelming." The audit results were spread across the conference table like the autopsy of a financial murder. $23 million in fraudulent transactions, shell companies, phantom investments, and outright theft. The forensic accountants had been thorough, tracing every suspicious transaction back to its source. "These are business investments," Brett insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "Every successful enterprise involves risk. Some investments succeed, others fail. Investments in companies that don't exist aren't risks," I said. "They're theft. Investments in properties that you personally own aren't business development. They're embezzlement." Douglas Fitzgerald cleared his throat. "Brett, I've reviewed the evidence carefully. The pattern is unmistakable. You've been systematically diverting trust assets for personal use. You're all ganging up on me because Julia has poisoned your minds with her vindictive theories." "The numbers speak for themselves," Miriam said. "Our father trusted you with the family legacy, and you've betrayed that trust in the worst possible way." Brett's composure finally cracked completely. "You want to know about betrayal? I'll tell you. About betrayal. I've spent my entire adult life building this business, expanding our influence, securing our position in this community. And now you're going to destroy everything because my ex-wife is vindictive about a divorce settlement. You destroyed everything the moment you decided that the family assets belonged to you personally," I replied. "I'm just making sure there are consequences." "What consequences? You want to send me to prison? Destroy the family name? Turn the Langford legacy into a cautionary tale about white-collar crime? I want justice. And I want restitution." Brett turned to his sister with desperation in his eyes. "Miriam, you can't let her do this. She's not family. She's not one of us. She's just a vindictive ex-wife who wants to burn down everything our father built." Miriam's expression was ice cold. "Our father built safeguards into the trust specifically to prevent this kind of betrayal. Julia isn't destroying his legacy. She's protecting it." "From what?" "From you." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Brett slumped in his chair, finally understanding that his charm and family connections couldn't save him from the consequences of his actions. "What do you want?" he asked quietly. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a detailed settlement agreement that Reggie and I had prepared. "Full restitution of all misappropriated assets. Your resignation from all positions within the family business. Your agreement to cooperate fully with the ongoing audit. And the immediate return of my grandmother's ring. And in exchange, we don't file criminal charges. You get to rebuild your life somewhere else, without the burden of a felony conviction." Brett studied the settlement agreement, his hands shaking slightly. "This would leave me with nothing. This would leave you with your freedom, which is more than you deserve. I need time to consider this. You have until 5 o'clock today. After that the offer expires and we proceed with criminal prosecution." Miriam leaned forward. "Brett, take the deal. It's more generous than you deserve, and it's the only way to protect what's left of the family reputation." "Easy for you to say. You're not the one losing everything. You lost everything the moment you decided to steal from your own family. This is just making it official. Brett left the meeting without signing the agreement, but I wasn't worried. He was trapped, and he knew it. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and the alternative to the settlement was federal prison. A tea for 30 that afternoon. He returned to Douglas Fitzgerald's office. This time, he brought a small velvet box. "Here's your ring," he said, placing the box on the table with enough force to make it rattle. I hope it was worth destroying a family. I opened the box carefully. And there it was, my grandmother's Art Deco diamond, still beautiful, despite everything it had been through. The sight of it brought tears to my eyes, not just because I was getting it back, but because of what it represented. "The only person who destroyed this family was you," I said quietly, slipping the ring onto my finger. "I just made sure there were consequences." Brett signed the settlement agreement with angry, jagged strokes of his pen. As he did, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice. "This isn't over," he said as he prepared to leave. "Actually, it is. And Brett, next time you decide to underestimate someone, remember this moment. Remember what happens when you assume that power is more important than character." He left without another word, and I never saw him again. 6 months later, I stood in the same conference room where Brett had signed his surrender. But the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. The quarterly trust meeting was a celebration of restored financial health and renewed purpose. "The restitution process is 90% complete," announced Sarah Mitchell, the new trust administrator Miriam and I had hired. "We've recovered $21.7 million in misappropriated assets, and the remaining items are expected to be resolved within the next 60 days. The transformation had been remarkable. Under new management, the Langford Family Trust had not only recovered its stolen assets but had actually grown in value. The careful investment strategy that Charles Langford C. Oster had originally envisioned was finally being implemented, free from Brett's reckless interference. "What's the status of the real estate portfolio?" Miriam asked. "We've repurchased the commercial building downtown and the Kiowa Island property. The beach house required some negotiation, but the new owners were willing to sell at a reasonable price once they understood the circumstances." The line went dead. 20 minutes later, Douglas Fitzgerald called to report that Brett had arrived at his office, demanding an emergency meeting with all parties involved. The second family meeting took place in Douglas Fitzgerald's conference room, a more neutral venue than the Langford estate. Brett arrived looking haggard and desperate, his usual polish replaced by the wild-eyed desperation of a cornered animal. "This is extortion," he announced without preamble. "You're using family loyalty to blackmail me into admitting to crimes I didn't commit. The only crime here is theft," Miriam replied coldly. "And the evidence is overwhelming." The audit results were spread across the conference table like the autopsy of a financial murder. $23 million in fraudulent transactions, shell companies, phantom investments, and outright theft. The forensic accountants had been thorough, tracing every suspicious transaction back to its source. "These are business investments," Brett insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "Every successful enterprise involves risk. Some investments succeed, others fail. Investments in companies that don't exist aren't risks," I said. "They're theft. Investments in properties that you personally own aren't business development. They're embezzlement." Douglas Fitzgerald cleared his throat. "Brett, I've reviewed the evidence carefully. The pattern is unmistakable. You've been systematically diverting trust assets for personal use. You're all ganging up on me because Julia has poisoned your minds with her vindictive theories." "The numbers speak for themselves," Miriam said. "Our father trusted you with the family legacy, and you've betrayed that trust in the worst possible way." Brett's composure finally cracked completely. "You want to know about betrayal? I'll tell you about betrayal. I've spent my entire adult life building this business, expanding our influence, securing our position in this community. And now you're going to destroy everything because my ex-wife is vindictive about a divorce settlement. You destroyed everything the moment you decided that the family assets belonged to you personally," I replied. "I'm just making sure there are consequences." "What consequences? You want to send me to prison? Destroy the family name? Turn the Langford legacy into a cautionary tale about white-collar crime? I want justice. And I want restitution." Brett turned to his sister with desperation in his eyes. "Miriam, You can't let her do this. She's not family. She's not one of us. She's just a vindictive ex-wife who wants to burn down everything our father built." Miriam's expression was ice cold. "Our father built safeguards into the trust specifically to prevent this kind of betrayal. Julia isn't destroying his legacy. She's protecting it. From what? From you." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Brett slumped in his chair, finally understanding that his charm and family connections couldn't save him from the consequences of his actions. "What do you want?" he asked quietly. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a detailed settlement agreement that Reggie and I had prepared. Full restitution of all misappropriated assets. Your resignation from all positions within the family business. Your agreement to cooperate fully with the ongoing audit. And the immediate return of my grandmother's ring. And in exchange, we don't file criminal charges. You get to rebuild your life somewhere else, without the burden of a felony conviction." Brett studied the settlement agreement, his hands shaking slightly. "This would leave me with nothing. This would leave you with your freedom, which is more than you deserve. I need time to consider this. You have until 5 o'clock today. After that, the offer expires and we proceed with criminal prosecution." Miriam leaned forward. "Brett, take the deal. It's more generous than you deserve, and it's the only way to protect what's left of the family reputation." "Easy for you to say. You're not the one losing everything. You lost everything the moment you decided to steal from your own family. This is just making it official." Brett left the meeting without signing the agreement, but I wasn't worried. He was trapped, and he knew it. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and the alternative to the settlement was federal prison. A tea for 30 that afternoon. He returned to Douglas Fitzgerald's office. This time, he brought a small velvet box. "Here's your ring," he said, placing the box on the table with enough force to make it rattle. "I hope it was worth destroying a family." I opened the box carefully, and there it was, my grandmother's Art Deco diamond, still beautiful despite everything it had been through. The sight of it brought tears to my eyes, not just because I was getting it back, but because of what it represented. "The only person who destroyed this family was you," I said quietly, slipping the ring onto my finger. "I just made sure there were consequences." Brett signed the settlement agreement with angry, jagged strokes of his pen. As he did, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice. "This isn't over," he said as he prepared to leave. "Actually, it is. And Brett, next time you decide to underestimate someone, remember this moment. Remember what happens when you assume that power is more important than character." He left without another word, and I never saw him again. 6 months later, I stood in the same conference room where Brett had signed his surrender, but the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. The quarterly trust meeting was a celebration of restored financial health. He listened to the financial reports with satisfaction, but my real focus was on the larger changes we'd implemented. The trust now had proper oversight mechanisms, independent auditing procedures, and clear accountability measures. Most importantly, it had a renewed commitment to the charitable purposes that Charles Langford Seoster had originally intended. The Charleston Children's Foundation has approved grants totaling $1.2 million this quarter, I reported. We've funded 3 new educational programs, expanded the scholarship fund, and provided emergency assistance to 12 families facing financial hardship. It was ironic that Brett's attempt to weaponize the foundation for his personal vendettas had ultimately led to its becoming more effective and generous than ever before. The money he had stolen from charitable purposes was now being used to actually help people. After the meeting, Miriam and I walked through the gardens of the family estate. The property was still beautiful, but it felt different now, less like a monument to privilege and more like a place where important work was being done. "Any regrets?" she asked. "About what?" "About bringing down Brett. About turning the family upside down. About becoming the woman who destroyed a Charleston legacy." I touched my grandmother's ring, which had become my daily reminder that justice and sentimentality could coexist. "I didn't destroy anything." I revealed the truth. "There's a difference. The community is still talking about it. The scandal of the Langford heir who stole from his own family trust. Let them talk. The truth has a way of surviving gossip." We walked in comfortable silence for a while, past the rose garden where I'd once felt like an outsider trying to prove my worth. Now I felt like exactly what I was, a competent professional doing important work. "What about Brett?" Miriam asked. Have you heard anything? He's living in Florida working for a small corporate law firm, using his mother's maiden name professionally. Douglas Fitzgerald handles any necessary communication through intermediaries. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd just let him keep the ring? I stopped walking and turned to face her. If I'd let him keep the ring, he would have continued stealing from your family until there was nothing left. The ring wasn't the cause of this situation, Miriam. It was just the catalyst that made me look closely enough to see what was really happening. You're probably right. I know I'm right. Your father included those trust provisions for a reason. He understood that power without accountability leads to corruption, and that family loyalty can become a weapon in the wrong hands. That evening, I returned to my apartment and poured myself a glass of wine. My grandmother's jewelry box sat open on the coffee table, all the pieces finally reunited. The ring looked perfect nestled among the other heirlooms, as if it had never been gone. My phone buzzed with a text from Reggie. Saw the quarterly report. You've officially doubled the trust's charitable giving from last year. Your grandmother would be proud. He was right. My grandmother would have been proud, not because I'd gotten my ring back, but because I'd used my skills and determination to protect something important from some and renewed purpose. The restitution process is 90% complete, announced Sarah Mitchell, the new trust administrator Miriam and I had hired. We've recovered $21.7 million in misappropriated assets, and the remaining items are expected to be resolved within the next 60 days. The transformation had been remarkable. Under new management, the Langford Family Trust had not only recovered its stolen assets but had actually grown in value. The careful investment strategy that Charles Langford C. Oster had originally envisioned was finally being implemented, free from Brett's reckless interference. What's the status of the real estate portfolio? Miriam asked. We've repurchased the commercial building downtown and the Kiowa Island property. The beach house required some negotiation, but the new owners were willing to sell at a reasonable price once they understood the circumstances. The preliminary committee is meeting next month. But Julia, there's something else you should know. The position would require you to work closely with the state attorney general's office. They're considering criminal charges against several other trust managers who may have used Brett's techniques. This was unexpected. I thought Brett's case was unique. So did we. But the investigation into his methods revealed a pattern of similar abuses throughout the Southeast. Apparently, your ex-husband was more creative than we realized. Other trust managers have been copying his techniques for hiding embezzlement. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October breeze coming off the harbor. How many cases are we talking about? Potentially dozens. The Attorney General's office estimates that over $60 million in family trust assets may have been misappropriated using variations of Brett's shell company techniques. The scope was staggering. Brett hadn't just stolen from his own family. He'd inadvertently created a blueprint that other corrupt trustees were following. What had seemed like an isolated case of family betrayal was actually part of a much larger pattern of systemic abuse. I'll need to think about this, of course. But Julia, you should know that several families have specifically requested your involvement. Word has gotten out about how you handled the Langford situation. People trust you. After hanging up, I sat in silence for several minutes, processing the implications. Taking on the task force would mean stepping into a much larger arena, dealing with cases that could dwarf the Langford theft in both scope and complexity. It would also mean reliving some of the darkest moments of my marriage and divorce on a much more public stage, but it would also mean ensuring that other families didn't have to experience what the Langfords had endured. It would mean turning Brett's legacy of theft into something positive, something that could protect innocent people from similar betrayals. My reflection was interrupted by Reggie bursting through the door with his characteristic enthusiasm. In the 2 years since the Langford case, he'd earned his paralegal certification and had become one of the most sought-after trust investigators in the region. Boss, you need to see this, he announced, waving a newspaper. Page 3, business section. The headline made my stomach clench. Former Charleston attorney arrested in Florida real estate fraud scheme. I read the article with growing disbelief. Brett had been arrested in Miami, charged with defrauding investors in a luxury condominium development that existed only on paper. The scheme was remarkably similar to his theft from the family trust, phantom investments, fabricated documentation, and the systematic diversion of other people's money for personal use. He didn't learn anything, I said quietly, Leopards and spots, Reggie replied. But here's the interesting part. The FBI agent quoted in the article says they're investigating connections to other cases throughout the Southeast. Sound familiar? It did sound familiar. Brett hadn't just been stealing from his family. He'd been refining techniques that he was apparently sharing with other corrupt professionals. The network of theft was larger and more organized than anyone had realized. There's more, Reggie continued, pulling out a legal document. I got a call from the Miami prosecutor's office this morning. They want you to testify about Brett's methods in the Langford case. Apparently, your documentation is crucial to establishing the pattern of behavior they need for federal charges. The request put me in an uncomfortable position. Testifying against Brett would mean reopening a chapter of my life that I'd worked hard to close. It would mean facing him again, this time in a federal courtroom where the stakes were much higher than civil restitution. But it would also mean ensuring that he faced consequences for a pattern of theft that apparently extended far beyond his family's trust. What's your recommendation? Professionally, you have an obligation to help other victims get justice. Personally, I think you've already given enough of your life to Brett Langford's crimes. Before I could respond, my phone rang. Miriam's voice was tense with barely controlled emotion. Julia, I just saw the news about Brett. Are you all right? I'm fine. Surprised, but fine. The FBI contacted me this morning. They want to interview me about Brett's activities while he was managing the trust. They think his theft from our family was just the beginning. I wasn't surprised. The techniques Brett had used were too sophisticated to have been developed for a single target. He'd clearly been experimenting, refining his methods, and possibly teaching them to others. What did you tell them? That I'd cooperate fully. Julia, if Brett has been doing this to other families, they deserve justice. Even if it means more publicity for your family? There was a long pause. Our father included those trust provisions because he understood that some things are more important than reputation. Justice is one of them. That evening, I drove out to Magnolia Cemetery, where my parents were buried in a modest plot overlooking the Ashley River. I'd been visiting regularly since moving back to Charleston, but tonight felt different. Tonight, I needed to think through the biggest decision of my professional life. My father's gravestone was simple. Clifford Reeve, attorney at law, 1942 to 2015. He kept his word. The inscription had been my mother's choice, a reflection of the values that had defined his career. My father had been the kind of lawyer who viewed the practice of law as a calling rather than just a profession. He'd built his reputation on integrity, competence, and an unwavering commitment to his clients' best interests. I wish you were here to give me advice, I said aloud, feeling only slightly foolish for talking to a gravestone. Brett's case is turning into something much bigger than I expected. I have a chance to help prevent other families from going through what we experienced. But it means stepping into a public role that I'm not sure I'm ready for. The evening breeze rustled through the ancient oak trees that shaded the cemetery, carrying the scent of jasmine and the distant sound of church bells from downtown Charleston. It was peaceful here, a place where the weight of difficult decisions seemed more manageable. I thought about the conversation with Judge Morrison, about the task force position and the opportunity to establish new protections for family trusts. I thought about the FBI's request for testimony and the chance to ensure that Brett faced consequences for the full scope of his crimes. Most of all, I thought about the other families who might be facing what the Langfords had endured. Families who trusted their relatives to manage inherited wealth responsibly, only to discover that trust had been systematically betrayed. My grandmother's ring caught the fading sunlight as I raised my hand to touch my father's gravestone. The diamond had been in our family for 4 generations, passed down through women who had faced their own difficult decisions with courage and integrity. My great-grandmother had worn it while working as a seamstress to support her family during the Depression. My grandmother had worn it while raising 5 children as a single mother after my grandfather's death in World War II. My mother had worn it while putting herself through college and law school in an era when women attorneys were rare and often unwelcome. Each of them had faced moments when the easy choice would have been to compromise their principles for convenience or safety. Each of them had chosen to do what was right rather than what was easy. Now it was my turn to make that choice. I think I know what you'd tell me to do, I said to my father's grave. You'd tell me that the law is only as strong as the people who are willing to stand up for it. You'd tell me that having the ability to help others comes with the responsibility to actually help them. I stayed at the cemetery until full darkness fell, watching the lights of Charleston twinkle across the harbor. By the time I drove home, I'd made my decision. The next morning, I called Judge Morrison to accept the task force position. Then I called the FBI to schedule my testimony about Brett's methods. Finally, I called Miriam to let her know that we would be taking a very public stand against trust abuse. Are you sure about this? She asked. Once we start down this path, there's no going back to privacy and anonymity, I'm sure. Besides, we stopped being private citizens the moment we decided to hold Brett accountable for his crimes. This is just the logical next step. What about your practice? Won't this kind of public role create conflicts of interest? It was a fair question. Leading a statewide task force on fiduciary abuse would indeed create potential conflicts with my private practice, but it would also create opportunities to do the kind of meaningful work that had drawn me to law in the first place. I'll restructure the practice. Focus on pro bono work for families dealing with trust abuse. Turn the expertise I gained from Brett's case into something that can help people who can't afford high-end legal representation. That sounds like something your father would have done. She was right. My father had always believed that legal expertise came with social responsibility. He'd spent countless hours providing free legal services to families who couldn't afford representation, viewing it as part of his professional obligation rather than as charity. Now I had the chance to honor that legacy while ensuring that Brett's techniques for theft couldn't be used against other innocent families. 2 weeks later, I received a call that brought the full circle of justice into sharp focus. The voice on the other end was elderly, but strong, with the distinctive accent of old Charleston. Mrs. Reeve, this is Margaret Caldwell. I believe you knew my grandson Daniel. I remembered Daniel Caldwell from law school. He'd been a year ahead of me, brilliant and dedicated, with plans to practice family law in his hometown. We'd lost touch after graduation, but I'd heard through mutual friends that he'd built a successful practice in Savannah. Of course, Mrs. Caldwell, how can I help you? I'm afraid Daniel is in some trouble, serious trouble, and I believe it's connected to your ex-husband's case. My blood ran cold. What kind of trouble? Daniel has been managing our family trust for the past 5 years. Last month, we discovered that nearly $2 million has gone missing. The techniques he used are apparently identical to what that Langford boy did to his own family. The implications hit me immediately. Brett hadn't just been stealing from his family and defrauding investors in Florida. He'd apparently been teaching his techniques to other attorneys, creating a network of trust theft that spanned multiple states. Mrs. Caldwell, I'm so sorry. Have you contacted law enforcement? We have, but the investigator said that your expertise with similar cases would be invaluable. He suggested that I call you directly. I'll help however I can. But Mrs. Caldwell, you should know that this may be part of a much larger pattern. Your family's case could be connected to numerous other thefts throughout the region. Then we need to stop it, don't we? Before other families lose their heritage the way we've lost ours. That conversation convinced me that accepting the task force position had been the right decision. Brett's corruption had metastasized, spreading throughout the legal community like a cancer that attacked the very foundation of family trust and financial security. Over the following weeks, similar calls came in from across the Southeast. Families in Georgia, North Carolina, and Tennessee reported trust thefts that followed the exact same pattern: phantom investments, shell companies, and the systematic diversion of inherited wealth for personal use. The FBI's investigation revealed that Brett had been networking with other corrupt attorneys through professional conferences and social clubs. He'd presented his theft techniques as innovative investment strategies and creative trust management solutions. What had started as his personal betrayal of his family's trust had become a criminal enterprise that had defrauded dozens of families out of tens of millions of dollars, but it had also created an opportunity for systematic reform. The task force I was now leading would have the authority to recommend new laws, establish oversight protocols, and create accountability measures that could prevent similar thefts in the future. As I prepared for my first public hearing as task force chair, I looked at my grandmother's ring and thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. Brett had kept the ring as a symbol of his power over me, never understanding that symbols of strength can't be possessed by people who lack the character to honor them. Now, 2 years later, the ring was back where it belonged, and I was using the expertise I'd gained from recovering it to protect other families from similar betrayals. Brett had tried to break me by taking something precious Instead, he'd given me the motivation to become someone who could break systems that allowed people like him to prey on trust and family loyalty. The irony was perfect, and the justice was complete. The federal courthouse in Columbia was packed with reporters, victims' families, and legal professionals when Brett's trial began 6 months later. As the government's key witness regarding his methods of financial manipulation, I had a front row seat to watch justice unfold on a scale I'd never imagined during my initial quest to recover a wedding ring. The prosecution had built their case around what they called the Langford method, a sophisticated system of trust theft that Brett had apparently been teaching to corrupt attorneys across the Southeast. What had begun as my personal fight for justice had evolved into the centerpiece of the largest white-collar crime prosecution in South Carolina history. Mrs. Reeve, Assistant U.S. Attorney Sandra Chen addressed me from the prosecution table. Please tell the court how you first became aware of the defendant's fraudulent activities. I looked directly at Brett as I answered. He sat at the defense table wearing an expensive suit that someone else had clearly paid for, his expression carefully neutral, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped his pen just a little too tightly. I became suspicious when my ex-husband refused to return my grandmother's wedding ring during our divorce proceedings. The vindictive nature of that action prompted me to examine his financial activities more closely. And what did that examination reveal? A systematic pattern of theft from his family's trust, disguised as legitimate business expenses and investment opportunities. For the next 2 hours, I walked the jury through Brett's techniques, the shell companies with legitimate sounding names, the phantom real estate investments, the cryptocurrency schemes that existed only on paper. I explained how he'd manipulated quarterly reports to hide losses and how he'd used his signature authority to avoid board oversight. But the most damaging testimony came when I described his networking activities with other corrupt attorneys. The defendant regularly attended legal conferences throughout the Southeast, ostensibly for continuing education purposes. However, evidence suggests that he was actually teaching other attorneys how to implement similar theft schemes in their own practices. Brett's attorney, a sharp-featured woman named Lisa Hartwell, tried to undermine my credibility during cross-examination. Mrs. Reeve, isn't it true that your testimony is motivated by personal animosity toward my client? My testimony is motivated by a desire for justice. Personal animosity became irrelevant the moment I discovered the scope of your client's criminal activities. But you admit that this entire investigation began because you were angry about a piece of jewelry? I smiled slightly. The investigation began because your client's behavior regarding the jewelry revealed a pattern of vindictive abuse that suggested deeper problems. And I was right. The trial continued for 3 weeks with testimony from victims across 4 states. The Caldwell family from Savannah described losing their ancestral plantation due to trust theft. A widow from Charlotte explained how her late husband's business partner had stolen her children's inheritance using Brett's techniques. A retired military officer from Atlanta detailed how his family's scholarship fund had been systematically looted by their trusted financial advisor. The pattern was always the same: respected professionals using their positions of trust to steal from families who had no reason to suspect betrayal. The techniques were sophisticated enough to avoid detection for years, but simple enough to be replicated by anyone with basic legal knowledge and flexible ethics. The most shocking revelation came during the FBI's presentation of evidence. Agent Michael Torres took the stand to describe what they'd discovered during their investigation of Brett's network. We've identified at least 47 cases of trust theft across 7 states, all using variations of techniques that can be traced back to the defendant's methods. The total amount stolen exceeds $83 million. $83 million. The number was staggering, representing the destroyed financial security of dozens of families who had trusted the wrong people with their most precious assets. But the scope went beyond simple theft. Several of the corrupt attorneys had been using their stolen funds to finance other criminal activities, money laundering, tax evasion, and in one case, funding a drug trafficking operation. Mr. Langford wasn't just stealing from families, Agent Torres continued. He was teaching others to do the same, creating a criminal network that has undermined public trust in the legal profession itself. During a break in testimony, I found myself in the courthouse hallway face to face with Brett for the first time since our final settlement meeting. He looked older, his hair graying at the temples, his face marked by the stress of 2 years of criminal investigation. Are you satisfied now? He asked quietly, glancing around to make sure we weren't overheard. I'm satisfied that justice is being served. Are you satisfied with the choices you made? You destroyed my life over a piece of jewelry. You destroyed your own life through a decade of systematic theft. The jewelry was just what made me look closely enough to see it. He stared at me for a long moment. I could have made you happy. Julia, we could have had a good life together. We could have had a good life if you'd been capable of treating me as an equal instead of as a possession to be controlled. But that was never really an option, was it? I loved you. No, Brett. You loved the idea of me. You loved having someone intelligent enough to enhance your reputation but vulnerable enough to be manipulated. When I started becoming too independent, you tried to break me down, and you broke me instead. I held you accountable. There's a difference. When the trial resumed, the defense tried to portray Brett as a victim of circumstance, a man who had made poor decisions under pressure, but who wasn't the criminal mastermind the prosecution depicted. My client is guilty of poor judgment and inadequate oversight, Lisa Hartwell argued in her closing statement, but the prosecution has failed to prove that he deliberately set out to defraud families or teach others to do the same. The prosecution's closing argument was delivered by Sandra Chen with surgical precision. The defendant didn't make poor decisions under pressure. He made calculated choices over a period of years, systematically stealing from his own family while simultaneously teaching others to do the same to theirs. This wasn't a moment of weakness. This was a criminal enterprise disguised as professional expertise. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning with their verdict: guilty on all counts of wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit theft. Brett showed no emotion as the verdict was read, but I saw his shoulders slump slightly as the reality of his situation finally sank in. Sentencing was scheduled for 2 months later, but the judge's comments during the verdict hearing made it clear that Brett would be facing significant prison time. Mr. Langford, you have violated the most sacred trust that exists in our legal system, the trust that families place in attorneys to protect their most precious assets. Your actions have not only harmed dozens of innocent people, but they've also undermined public confidence in the legal profession itself. After the trial, I was approached by several victims' families who wanted to thank me for my role in bringing Brett to justice. But the conversation that affected me most came from Margaret Caldwell, Daniel's grandmother. Mrs. Reeve, I want you to know that your courage in pursuing this case gave us the strength to fight for our own justice. Without your example, we might have just accepted our losses and tried to move on. How is Daniel doing? Her expression grew sad. He's cooperating with the prosecution in exchange for a reduced sentence. The shame of what he did has destroyed him, but at least he's trying to make amends, and your family's trust will recover most of it, thanks to the restitution requirements. But more importantly, we've learned that trust has to be earned and verified, not just given because someone has the right credentials. That evening, I sat in my office reviewing the task force recommendations that would be submitted to the state legislature the following week. The reforms we were proposing would require independent auditing of all family trusts over a certain size, establish criminal penalties for fiduciary abuse, and create a victim compensation fund for families whose assets couldn't be fully recovered. The legislation was being called the Langford Act, a name that carried ironic justice. Brett's name would be permanently associated with protecting families from the kind of theft he had pioneered, but beyond the legal reforms, the case had prompted a broader conversation about accountability and oversight in the legal profession. Bar associations across the Southeast were implementing new continuing education requirements focused on ethical trust management. Law schools were adding courses on fiduciary responsibility and the warning signs of financial abuse. The ripple effects of my decision to fight for my grandmother's ring had transformed into a wave of reform that would protect countless families for generations to come. As I prepared to leave the office that night, my phone rang with a call that brought the emotional journey full circle. Julia, this is your cousin Sarah from Virginia. I know we haven't talked much since the wedding, but I wanted to call and tell you how proud Grandma would be of what you've accomplished. Sarah was my grandmother's great-niece, one of the few family members who had maintained detailed memories of the woman whose ring had started this entire odyssey. I've been following the news coverage of the trial, and I keep thinking about the stories Grandma used to tell about facing down bullies and standing up for what's right. She always said that courage isn't about not being afraid, it's about doing what needs to be done even when you are afraid. I think about her every day, I said, touching the ring that had become my daily reminder of the strength that could be inherited along with jewelry. She used to say that the ring would always find its way to the woman who needed its strength the most. I think she would be amazed to know that recovering it led to protecting so many other families. After hanging up, I sat in the gathering darkness of my office, looking out at the Charleston harbor where ships had carried generations of my family to new lives and new challenges. My grandmother had made that journey as a young bride, wearing her new wedding ring as a symbol of hope and commitment. Now that same ring was a symbol of justice served and systems reformed. Brett had tried to use it as a weapon against me, never understanding that symbols of strength can't be diminished by the people who try to possess them. In days, Brett would be sentenced to what would likely be 20 years in federal prison. The families he'd defrauded would receive restitution. The attorneys who had followed his methods would face their own prosecutions. The legal reforms we'd recommended would become law, but more importantly, the message would be clear: trust is sacred, abuse has consequences, and justice can be patient, but it is inevitable. The ring had come home, and so had accountability. 5 years after Brett's sentencing, I stood in the newly dedicated Clifford Reeve Center for Legal Ethics at the Charleston School of Law, surrounded by portraits of legal pioneers who had shaped the profession with integrity and courage. The irony wasn't lost on me that this center, named for my father and funded by restitution from Brett's crimes, had become the region's leading institution for training attorneys in fiduciary responsibility. Ladies and gentlemen, Dean Patricia Williams addressed the assembled crowd of attorneys, judges, and law students. Please welcome the keynote speaker for our annual ethics symposium, the chair of the Southeast Fiduciary Protection Task Force, and the attorney whose work led to the landmark reforms we now know as the Langford Act, Julia Reeve. The applause was warm and sustained, but I felt the familiar mix of pride and humility that accompanied public recognition for work that had begun with such personal pain. As I approached the podium, I caught sight of several familiar faces in the audience: Judge Elaine Morrison, who had become a close friend and mentor; Miriam Langford, now the successful director of one of the South's most respected charitable foundations; and Reggie Taylor, who had completed law school and was now my partner in what had become the region's premier trust protection practice. Thank you for that generous introduction, I began, my voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. 5 years ago, if someone had told me that I would be standing here today discussing legal ethics and fiduciary reform, I would have thought they were delusional. 5 years ago, I was a recently divorced attorney whose primary concern was recovering a family heirloom that my ex-husband had vindictively refused to return. A ripple of knowing laughter moved through the audience. The story of how my fight for my grandmother's ring had led to the largest trust fraud prosecution in regional history had become something of a legend in legal circles, but that experience taught me something that I want to share with you today, particularly with the law students who are just beginning their careers. The law is not just a profession, it's a sacred trust. Every time a client places their financial security, their family's future, or their most precious assets in our hands, they're making an act of faith that we will honor our obligations to them. I paused, looking out at the young faces in the audience who would soon be taking their bar exams and entering a profession that had been forever changed by the reforms we'd implemented. Brett Langford violated that trust on a scale that shocked even experienced prosecutors. But his crimes weren't unique because of their sophistication or their scope. They were unique because they revealed how easy it is for trusted professionals to betray the people who depend on them, and how difficult it can be for victims to seek justice when the system itself has been compromised. The audience was completely silent now, understanding that they were hearing not just a legal analysis but a personal testimony about the cost of professional betrayal. The reforms we've implemented over the past 5 years: mandatory independent auditing, enhanced criminal penalties for fiduciary abuse, victim compensation funds, and improved oversight mechanisms. These weren't just regulatory adjustments. They were a recognition that trust, once broken, can destroy not just individual families but entire communities' faith in the legal system. I looked directly at the law students in the front rows. You're entering a profession that has been strengthened by confronting its own vulnerabilities. The temptations that led Brett Langford to steal millions of dollars from his own family still exist. The opportunity to abuse positions of trust still presents itself regularly. What's different now is that we've created systems to detect that abuse and consequences that make it far more dangerous to attempt. After my speech, the reception was held in the center's main conference room, where the walls displayed the names of families whose experiences had contributed to the legal reforms. The Langford name was there, along with the Caldwells, the Mitchells, the Hendersons, and dozens of other families whose trust had been betrayed but whose courage in seeking justice had made the system stronger. Julia, a voice behind me said. That was beautifully done. I turned to find a woman in her 60s, elegantly dressed and carrying herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard in important rooms. I'm Elizabeth Montgomery, from the American Bar Association's Ethics Committee. We've been following your work very closely. Thank you. I know the ABA has been instrumental in implementing similar reforms in other states. Actually, that's what I wanted to discuss with you. We're considering a national expansion of the Langford Act provisions, but we'd need someone with your expertise to lead the implementation. The offer was tempting. After 5 years of working within South Carolina's legal system, the opportunity to influence national policy was appealing, but it would also mean stepping away from the direct client work that had become the most meaningful part of my practice. I'm honored by the consideration, but I'm not sure I'm ready to leave Charleston. I understand, but think about it. The techniques Brett used weren't limited to the Southeast. We're seeing similar patterns of trust abuse across the country, and we need someone with your experience to help address them. As the reception continued, I found myself drawn to a quiet corner where Miriam was standing alone, looking at a display about the charitable work that had been funded by restitution from the various trust fraud cases. How are you doing? I asked. Better than I expected, actually. The foundation has never been more effective, and working with other families who've experienced similar betrayals has been surprisingly healing. Any regrets about how everything unfolded? Miriam was quiet for a moment. I regret that my brother chose to become a criminal. I regret that our family's name will always be associated with financial fraud, but I don't regret that he faced consequences for his actions. Have you heard from him recently? He writes occasionally from prison. The letters are always the same self-pity, blame, claims that he was treated unfairly. He still doesn't understand that his actions had consequences for real people. What does he say about the reforms? He calls them the Julia Reeve revenge laws. He can't seem to grasp that they're actually protection measures that could have prevented his crimes if they'd existed earlier. I wasn't surprised. Brett had always viewed accountability as a personal attack rather than a professional obligation. Even from prison, he apparently continued to see himself as the victim of circumstances rather than the architect of his own downfall. There's something else, Miriam continued. I've been thinking about writing a book about our family's experience. Not just the financial aspects, but the emotional cost of discovering that someone you trusted completely had been betraying you for years. That could be valuable for other families dealing with similar situations. That's what I'm hoping. Too many people think trust fraud is just about money, but it's really about the destruction of family relationships and the loss of faith in institutions. As the evening wound down, I found myself standing alone in the center's library, surrounded by texts on legal ethics and fiduciary responsibility. Many of the newer books included case studies based on Brett's prosecution, turning his crimes into teaching tools for future attorneys. My phone buzzed with a text from Reggie. Saw your speech on the legal network. Proud to be your partner. Also, new case just came in, sounds like a Langford method situation in Asheville. Ready to go save another family? I smiled, typing back, always ready. That's what we do. The work had become more than just a profession. It was a calling that connected my personal experience of betrayal and recovery to a larger mission of protecting families from similar harm. Every case we took reminded me that the legal system was only as strong as the people willing to fight for justice, even when that fight began with something as simple as recovering a wedding ring. As I prepared to leave the center, I stopped for a moment at my father's portrait in the main hallway. The inscription beneath it read, Clifford Reeve, 1942 to 2015. He kept his word and taught others to do the same. I hope I'm making you proud, I said quietly, touching my grandmother's ring. The diamond caught the light from the chandelier above, throwing tiny rainbows across the wall. The ring had been passed down through 4 generations of women who had faced their own challenges with courage and integrity. Now it was my turn to ensure that it would continue to inspire strength in future generations. Outside, Charleston's historic district was quiet in the evening air, the gas lamps casting warm pools of light along the cobblestone streets. I walked slowly toward my car, processing the evening's conversations and the opportunities that lay ahead. The offer from the American Bar Association would mean taking the fight against fiduciary abuse to a national level. It would mean helping other states implement the kind of reforms that had made South Carolina a model for trust protection. It would also mean stepping away from the direct client work that had become so meaningful to me. But as I thought about all the families across the country who might be experiencing what the Langfords had endured, the betrayal, the financial devastation, the loss of faith in institutions, I realized that the choice wasn't really a choice at all. My fight had begun with a single ring and a single act of vindictive cruelty. It had grown to encompass a criminal network that spanned multiple states and affected dozens of families. Now it had the potential to influence national policy and protect countless families from similar betrayals. The ring had always been about more than sentiment or family history. It had been about the values it represented: integrity, resilience, and the courage to fight for what's right even when the odds seem impossible. Brett had tried to use those values against me, never understanding that symbols of strength become more powerful when they're tested by adversity. Now, 5 years later, I understood that my grandmother's ring had found its way to me at exactly the moment when I needed its strength the most. And that strength had grown through use, expanding from personal recovery to family justice to systemic reform. I got into my car and drove home through the quiet streets of Charleston, past the historic homes where generations of families had built their legacies through commerce, law, and public service. My own legacy was still being written, but I knew now what it would be built on: the understanding that justice delayed is not justice denied, that patience and precision can be more powerful than anger and revenge, and that sometimes the smallest acts of cruelty can reveal the largest opportunities for reform. Brett had kept my wedding ring, thinking it would be the last wound he could inflict. Instead, he had given me the motivation to become someone who could heal the wounds that people like him inflicted on families who trusted the wrong people with their most precious assets. The ring was home, justice had been served, and the system was stronger because of what we had endured and overcome. But most importantly, I had learned that some battles are worth fighting not because of what you might gain, but because of what you refuse to lose. And sometimes, those battles change not just your own life, but the lives of countless others who will never know your name but will benefit from your courage. As I pulled into my driveway, I made the decision that would define the next chapter of my story. Tomorrow, I would call Elizabeth Montgomery and accept the position with the American Bar Association. It was time to take the fight national. The ring caught the porch light as I walked to my front door, its diamond facets reflecting the promise that justice, like light, can be refracted and multiplied until it illuminates for more than anyone ever imagined possible. Brett Langford had stolen millions of dollars and betrayed dozens of families. But in the end, his greatest crime had been underestimating the woman whose grandmother's ring he had tried to keep as a trophy. That ring was now worn by someone who understood that true power comes not from taking what you want, but from protecting what matters. And what mattered most was ensuring that future generations of families would never have to endure what we had survived. The story had begun with a wedding ring and a bitter divorce. It was ending with a legacy of reform that would protect families for decades to come. Justice, it turned out, was indeed best served cold and with the kind of precision that my grandmother would have recognized and approved. Epilogue. 10 years later. Notification appeared on my phone as I was reviewing cases for the morning's Senate subcommittee hearing on national fiduciary reform. Breaking news: former attorney Brett Langford dies in federal prison. I set down my coffee and read the brief article. Brett had died of a heart attack during his 10th year of incarceration, just 3 years before his scheduled release. The article mentioned that he had been working in the prison law library, helping other inmates with their appeals. I felt no satisfaction at the news, only a quiet sense of closure. Brett's story was over, but the work he had inadvertently inspired would continue long beyond his death. Later that morning, as I testified before Congress about the need for federal fiduciary protection standards, I touched my grandmother's ring and thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The ring had been passed down through 4 generations of strong women, and now it would be passed down to the next generation, carrying a new story of resilience and justice. My daughter Sarah, named for my grandmother, was now in law school. planning to specialize in elder law and estate protection. She wore a simple chain around her neck with a small diamond pendant, a piece of my grandmother's ring that had been reset for her 18th birthday. "The ring will be yours someday," I had told her when I gave her the pendant. "But more importantly, the values it represents will be yours. Use them wisely." As I finished my testimony and prepared to return to Charleston, I realized that the true victory hadn't been recovering the ring or seeing Brett prosecuted. It had been transforming personal pain into systemic change, turning one woman's fight for justice into protection for countless families. Brett Langford had died in prison, but his name would live on in the laws that protected families from people like him. It was the kind of immortality he had never wanted, but had ultimately earned through his crimes, and my grandmother's ring would continue to be passed down through generations of women who understood that true strength comes not from what you can take, but from what you choose to protect. The story was complete, but the legacy would endure. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.